Hello everybody, welcome to number 27, I'm Jack. Now this Triumph came out in 1966, a time derided by many as the start of the rot setting in to the British motor industry. And indeed this car, the Gt6, does display a lot of those symptoms. It was released with a dangerous handling flaw. It uses an outdated chassis and the marketing was based on a lie. I think this is Triumph's biggest missed opportunity. We will look at each of those three things in turn to explain why it didn't do as well as it should have. It was essentially a fastback version of the Spitfire, which in itself dated back to the 1959 Herald, so it wasn't a fresh design, and the separate chassis on body construction was already outdated by the time it was launched. This system though did mean that they could make many different cars on the same chassis at a point in time where they didn't have very much money, so they were able to offer a wide range despite limited resources. The Spitfire was launched in '63 and was a huge success. To capitalise on this, they commissioned Giovanni Michelotti, the Italian designer, to come up with a coupe version, and the result is even better looking than the original. There was a problem though. The extra weight from the added bodywork proved to be too much for the little 1.1 litre Spitfire engine. So the project was shelved, and that could have been the end of the GT6. But Triumph's racing department found that this was actually a very efficient aerodynamic design. So they used it on their race entry for Le Mans. And that car came first in its class and 13th overall, a brilliant result. That inspired upper management to take a look at the project again. To give it the power that it needed, they put in the 2-litre straight six from the Vitesse, which surprisingly still only puts out 104 horsepower. But then again, it only had 900 kilos to push. The first GT6s came with swing axle rear suspension, something it inherited from the Herald Saloon. Now the problem is, swing axle suspension has huge camber change at the extremes of travel. Now that's something that's maybe acceptable on a little commuter car like a Beetle, which also had that. But on a sports car like this, that's a real problem. When the suspension goes at full droop, for example, the wheels literally tuck in, something that could be very dangerous. The motoring press in the US was particularly outraged by this problem. And with that being Triumph's biggest market, they were forced to do something about it. So later cars like this one, Mark IIs and Mark IIIs, have an updated setup. Let's see if they cured the problem. Now, there were three versions of the GT6. The Mark I was the infamous one with the dangerous rear suspension setup that used to tuck. But I think it's also the best looking. In a dark colour with wire wheels, they look fantastic. The Mark IIs, they used a Rotaflex rear suspension setup and then changed that again for the Mark III to something that still worked well but was cheaper to produce. This uses the last version. It was originally a Rotaflex car but has been updated to use the last version of that rear suspension. It also has a slightly smaller steering wheel and aftermarket alloys. But apart from that, it's pretty much standard. Okay, so let's start off with the strong point, and that is the engine. Let's just take it through the gears here and see how it feels. It certainly sounds good. I can tell you that already. All right. The gear change is is something that you really feel in this car. It takes center stage in some ways because it's heavy, and the travel from side to side is so long that when you're going from second, it's easy to try and put it back into first. You really have to pull it to the side to get it in. It has its charm because being so heavy, it's also quite precise. It just gives the car a manly character, let's say. The engine isn't that quick. I mean, 104 horsepower, yes, it's light, it's 4 speeds, I keep forgetting. I'll just put it into overdrive, yep. Overdrive you can have in 3rd and 4th, but it sounds lovely. It's really, really smooth as well. The steering has some weight to it, which is good, because on the straight ahead, the car wanders a little bit, and if it was any lighter, I think it would start to feel a bit unstable. There's something though which is still not very confident inspiring about the way it takes the corners. It feels like it wants to push wide, but I don't completely trust the back of the car either. I think maybe it's just the kind of car that you need to get to know before you can get the best out of it. I think the fact that the engine doesn't feel too responsive isn't helped by quite a long throttle travel. But overall, it just doesn't feel like the sort of lump that wants to be pushed very hard. Now, I think when this was first released, Triumph knew that it wasn't quite right. There was obviously that issue with the rear suspension, which just shouldn't have been on a sports car. But in order to try and big it up as much as possible, the marketing department said that this was a direct development of the Le Mans race-winning cars. I guess you can't really blame them for that, except that it's completely untrue. The GT project predated... Oh, someone who's had a bit of a crash there, I think. Yeah, the GT project actually predated the Le Mans cars, and there was nothing in common with them at all, except for the way that the body shell looked. Now, despite this lie, this was a commercial flop. By 1973, they just weren't selling enough of them, and by 73, they pulled it off the market altogether, which is a massive shame because I think this had the potential to be a complete knockout car that really could have put Triumph on the map. After all, there was nobody that was selling a small coupe for this cheap amount of money with a 6-cylinder engine at the front as well. Now, driven today, I have to say that it does feel its age. The ergonomics are absolutely all over the place. I think one of the funniest things ever is where the ignition key is. It's so low down, right almost in between your feet. Then all the dials are scattered all over the place. And the various switch gear as well, that doesn't make much sense. The heating controls are at least all in one place. And I like the fact that you have the fan controls with sort of car defrost, then maximum, but then if you want more, there's a boost button where you pull it and it gives you a little bit extra ventilation. Not very much though, I think, by the feel of it. The steering wheel is massive. It's sort of offset to the left and tilted down to the right towards the front wing. And the pedals are comically off to the right. Before, when I was maneuvering it around, I thought that the brakes were stuck on, and that's because I was pressing the brake pedal rather than the dainty little throttle. At the front, the suspension is okay. It's a sort of double wishbone setup from what I can see. Now, this has the later revision, and the back end feels reasonably secure. Mind you, I haven't been pushing it very much. The whole thing feels a little bit ponderous. It feels quite heavy despite being a small car because the controls have some heft to them, the gear change in particular. It rides pretty well though. Inside, there isn't a huge amount of space for your lower body, but it's not too bad. Getting in, you kind of notice that it's a bit cramped, but once you're in place, there is sort of enough room there. Now, I've been trying to put my finger on what it is, which isn't that confidence inspiring about the front end on this car. I couldn't quite work it out, and I think I've got to it now, and it is the steering. It's just not very responsive off center, but once you have the steering input in, it's almost as if the car wants to overcompensate for that by carrying on turning more than you mean originally. It's something that with time you get used to, and then it doesn't really bother you as much, but initially it can be a little bit disconcerting. It's just as if maybe the steering isn't fully consistent in the way it behaves. Let's just do one more pull through the gears and then I'll sum up how I feel about the GT6. So overdrive is off. First gear. It does sound good, and you have to keep, well, basically change up at 5,000, even maybe 4.5. It doesn't want to be revved particularly highly. Once you get a bit more comfortable with it though, I'm starting to trust it a bit more. Still not massively, but I'm trusting it a little bit more comfortable with it, and I think it's just the kind of car that you have to drive at 6/10 to make it feel good. Really does feel like a mini GT rather than an out-and-out sports car in many ways. So how to sum up the GT6? I think Triumph were on to a massive winner when they had this concept. A beautiful coupe, tiny in proportions, but with a beefy 6-cylinder engine. They could have done wonderful things with it, and yet it didn't succeed. It wasn't the pricing, because it came out at an affordable price, and in the state that it's in today, it's not a dynamic wonder, but I think it compares reasonably well to other cars of the day. Maybe an MGB would have felt a little bit more solid overall, but for this money you wouldn't have got the 6-cylinder engine. Why didn't it work? Well, I think that the initial cars for the US market, they had a big impact because they were considered dangerous. I don't know what they could have done about the running gear. There isn't really, these are the resources that they had at the time, and it was British blokes in sheds building cars, and with the limitations that they had, I still think they did a brilliant job. Had they had a little bit more money to perhaps spend a bit more on the running gear, I think this could have completely turned around Triumph's fortunes. You can imagine a British mini muscle car. It would have been fantastic. All the same, as a classic today, I really like it. Thank you all so much for watching. Thank you, Rich, for bringing it down today. I've really enjoyed being in this. Look forward to seeing you all for the next video.